Galston was born on April 20, 1920 in Brooklyn. He grew up wanting to be a doctor, but because of the Great Depression, his family could not afford medical school, so he attended Cornell Agricultural College, which was free to citizens of New York State. During his first year there, he was entranced by an excellent botany professor named Loren Petrie, a person whose picture still hangs in Galston's office over 60 years later. Petrie inspired Galston to turn down an acceptance to Cornell Veterinary School and earn his bachelor's in botany instead. He continued to earn a doctorate in botany and biochemistry from the University of Illinois. In his doctorate thesis, he discovered that tribenzoic acid, otherwise known as TIBA, would speed up the flowering of soybeans. He also noted that in higher concentrations, it would defoliate the soybeans, causing it to lose all its leaves and die. Nevertheless, he hoped that TIBA could solve world famines and contribute to the global community. By now, America had joined World War II for 3 years, and Galston was conscripted into the U.S. Navy. He had a very benign time in service, serving as a natural resource officer in Okinawa. When he returned to America, he immediately jumped back into his science career. He worked at various science education positions until he was offered the chair of the botany department and full professorship at Yale, where he worked as a permanent job. During his service, scientists at Fort Detrick, the center of the U.S. Biological Weapons Program, had read Galston's research on TIBA and created a defoliant out of a mixture of 2,4-dichlorophenoxyacetic acid and 2,4,5-trichlorophenoxyacetic acid, known as Agent Orange. Since World War II, the military had been interested in exploring the capabilities of defoliants. Without them, enemy forces and fortifications could be hidden in the forest. The Allies suffered heavy casualties when storming some beaches in the Pacific, and attempts to shoot down the trees with ammunition were fruitless. Now they had a brutally effective way to deal with the enemy usage of vegetation. After the First Indochina War, it was decided that Vietnam, newly independent from France, was to be split into 2 states. North Vietnam would be governed by communists under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, and South Vietnam with full U.S. backing. Before long, communist-backed guerrillas in the South called the Viet Cong started attacking South Vietnamese and U.S. troops. Not wanting South Vietnam to fall to communism, the U.S. sent in more combatants to resolve the issue. In turn, the North Vietnamese sent in more troops of their own, escalating the conflict into a bloody struggle lasting over 20 years and responsible for the loss of over 1 million lives. The Vietnam War was characterized by guerrilla warfare. Viet Cong soldiers used hit-and-run tactics while the jungle gave them cover. The Viet Cong sustained themselves with the support of rural areas of the country, where peasants provided them food and new recruits. The vegetation of the rural areas also provided concealment, giving them a much-needed edge over better armed and better trained American soldiers. To combat this, the U.S. launched Operation Ranch Hand in 1962, which involved spraying defoliants and herbicides over rural areas of South Vietnam, in an attempt to deprive the Viet Cong of food and vegetation cover. The operation was also a part of a general policy of forced draft urbanization, which aimed to destroy the ability of peasants to support themselves in the countryside, forcing them to flee to the U.S.-dominated cities. In total, over an estimated 20 million gallons of defoliants and herbicides was sprayed on South Vietnam. Opposers to the U.S. government's massive use of herbicides began as early as 1964, when the Federation of American Scientists urged the government not to use chemical and biological weapons, as these weapons did not discriminate between fighting forces and normal civilians, especially with the spraying of crop fields. Arthur Galston began his fight against Agent Orange in 1965 by sending numerous letters to President Lyndon B. Johnson and his colleagues in botany, warning them about the ecological impact Agent Orange will have on the environment. Galston traveled to Vietnam to investigate the catastrophic impact of the chemicals on the local ecosystem, as well as the people's lives.
He made at least one trip to what was then Northwest. He was trying to ascertain the extent of the damage to vegetation. He was trying to ascertain the extent to which deposits of these weapons had been left in the soil, and in his activism first took the form of actual field research and conversations with people on the ground to try to verify what aerial photography and also his own scientific experience suggested was going on. Well, my understanding is that he was trying to ascertain the extent of the damage to vegetation. He was trying to ascertain, the extent to which deposits of these weapons had been left in the soil and in the food supply.
In broadcasts and seminars, he informed both the scientific community and the general public on the effects of the use of Agent Orange. He published academic papers, the most prominent being Science and Social Responsibility, a case history. In it, Galston describes and quantifies the destruction of tree and plant species, as well as the detrimental effect that mangrove riverbank spraying had on fish in stunning detail. Johnson would not reply to his letters. The rest of the scientific community was also ignored. In response to the petition signed by more than 5,000 scientists, a Department of Defense official stated that
qualified scientists both inside and outside the government have judged that seriously adverse consequences will not occur. Unless we had confidence in these judgments, we would not continue to employ these materials.
The ardent opposition of so many of the nation's leading scientists, combined with the effect it had on the ever more discontent general public, forced the government to make concessions. They tried to compromise, ordering a ban on biological weapons and conducting the long-asked-for study on long-term effects of Agent Orange. Some scientists were convinced by the government. Some were even in favor of the government. The anti-herbicide movement slowed as many scientists lost enthusiasm and left the cause. But Galston would not compromise. He was undaunted and continued to lobby both his scientific colleagues and the government. The study commissioned by the Department of Defense could not provide conclusive answers about the long-term effects of exposure to herbicides on the ecological system or on the population, and recommended further studies of the long-term effects on the environment and the population in order to assess properly the consequences of repeated use of herbicides. Meanwhile, the use of Agent Orange escalated along with the war. US C-123 planes with a capacity of 1,000 gallons sprayed South Vietnam relentlessly at a rate of 3 gallons per acre. In 1970, with Matthew S. Meselson of Harvard University and many other scientists, Galston charged that Agent Orange also presented a potential risk to humans. The scientists lobbied the Department of Defense to conduct toxicological studies, which found that compounds in Agent Orange could be linked to birth defects in laboratory rats. After knowing this, Galston contacted his old colleague from Caltech and was able to meet with Lee A. Dubridge, who was President Richard Nixon's science advisor. Together with Matthew Meselson, they presented the information of Agent Orange to Dubridge. With this information, he was able to persuade President Nixon to end Operation Ranch Hand and terminate the U.S. military policy of developing and using herbicides. The spraying of Agent Orange was fully discontinued in 1971. Galston, although having stopped the government's usage of Agent Orange, knows that irreversible damage has been done to Vietnam. In an essay, he talks about the idea of social responsibility in science. He said,
"There will be little we can do to make retribution to the Vietnamese whose land has been desecrated. At the very most, one can use this experience to prevent a resumption of similar operations elsewhere in the future."
He spent the last 20 years of his life, which included 15 years of alleged retirement, focused on bioethical issues. He established a bioethics program at Yale University, which became a major center for bioethical research. More and more of his own writing turned in that direction, and I am convinced that his experiences with Agent Orange during the 1960s were decisive in turning his interests even more towards the public dimension of science.
But the scars of Agent Orange go far beyond just the environment. 2.5 million U.S. veterans and millions more Vietnamese were exposed to the toxic dioxins of Agent Orange. U.S. veterans returning from Vietnam reported cancers and skin diseases from exposure to the dioxin, and the Vietnamese government claimed that over 500,000 deaths can be directly attributed to Agent Orange, as well as another 500,000 birth defects. Arthur Galston's refusal to compromise in his conflict with the U.S. government's use of Agent Orange in the Vietnam War contributed greatly to the eventual end of the use of Agent Orange, preventing further damage to the Vietnamese environment and saving numerous lives.